language and political control. Now, how come that language is related to political control? And we can understand this through the concept of language as a constructed social act. That would mean that what we call a language is only we decide to call it a language. It's not something that it is a social and a historical, and it is something out there, and we just have to discover that this is a language. Now, an evidence in this regard is that if you go about finding out how many different languages there are, there you will have a figure of 40,000 languages. Sometimes you have a figure of 7,000 languages. So you choose which languages do you want to call language and which ones do you only think it's a variety of that language, and you choose to ignore similarities and differences between those languages and you call it a language. So that is definitely a social act, a decision which you make. Now, once that kind of decision is made, especially by the people in power and by people who want to consolidate their political power, then the next step usually is the establishment of academies. Now, what is the role of these language academies? The role of these language academies is to standardize these languages, add more vocabulary to it that might be related to the changing circumstances, and then to decide and to sort of legitimize a language as a certain kind of language. And throughout in history, so this establishment of academies is not a new or a very modern phenomena. You have the first language academy in 1572 in Florence, and this was to uphold the Tuscan dialect of Dante. And then you have another language academy in 1635 in France. And the point of this academy was to purify the language. You have another one in Spain, which is in 1713, which was to actually uncontaminate the Spanish language. So what you think is contaminating language or making it vulgar, or what you think is somehow uplifting its standard, it's a social decision. It's a decision that you make and people with power actually make. For instance, when East and West Pakistan were one country, there were language academies that worked deliberately to take out certain vocabulary items from Bengali that belonged to Sanskrit and to add instead Arabic and Persian words to it. This is what these academies do. So during the 18th century, language academies in Europe were very much there. Then Arabic academies throughout Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and later on in Asia, in Malaysia, very much there. And the point was to consolidate the standardization of language and through it to sort of establish the political power of the state. So selection of language, what is a language? Purification, standardization. This is all a political act and it is done with a certain kind of political ideology. For instance, this knowing of Urdu came to be identified with this Islamic ideology. So the words from Sanskrit were removed because they were thought of as un-Islamic, although their language is just an expression. Interestingly, there has never been an official academy of English. Although English has spread so much, however, you see that English is very much standardized. You see that there is a difference between American English and this British English. And then this all has been done through the role of dictionaries. You have the first dictionary in 1968. This is the Fowler's Dictionary, which talks about which presents all the different vocabulary in English, so as to remove, all the words that they thought of as inappropriate. And interestingly, if you look at the other dictionary in US in 1827, what this dictionary did was it somehow disassociated itself with the British English. And this was again a political act because it was a sign of independence. So they wanted to be free from this British colonial history, and they wanted to distance themselves. So although they were speaking in English, yes, yet they were using different words now for the same thing, and they were using different spellings for the same thing. For instance, CENTRE is British English, CENTER might be the US English. So they try to be different from the British. And interestingly, if you see how languages were standardized in the European context, and it happened when the last Arab kingdom in Grenada was defeated, and now people wanted to sort of like consolidate their own power, political power, and establish their state. So political power is consolidated through language, and this language is then imposed on the other people. So anything that is not within the same remit is dismissed. On the other hand, it is interesting to note that a language makes little sense in the traditional societies and the way they do things, because they use multiple languages at the same time. And it is argued that this concept of a language is actually a European artifact, and it was done deliberately for consolidating political power.